Hello, and welcome to the next video in the Intro to Creative Web Dev, Intro to Creative Coding series that I've been doing. We are now quite a few weeks into it, and you have learned all about P5 and calling functions and using if statements, and the fact that P5 has this draw loop where draw is called 60 times a second, which you can use for animation. You've learned all of that already. And this video builds on that to introduce ways to get input from the user. So there's a couple ways I could do this. First, maybe I'll just start by mentioning that you can learn all of this from the reference. If you scroll down to here, the events section of the reference, I'm going to talk through some of these, not all of it, but I'm going to talk through just enough of them so that you get a sense of how they kind of work, and then from there you can branch out into whatever kinds of things you want to do. So that's kind of one way to get the information, but I'll kind of just chat through it here in this video. So let me start by opening up my editor. I'll go to the handy dandy P5 editor, and this gives me a canvas. And by now you are probably pretty used to this boring gray square. So I can do something like draw a square, and I can give it something like an X position of like 150, a Y position of let's say 250, and a size of 100. And that'll work. Now I've got my beautiful white circle on my beautiful gray background, and I can change these numbers. I can say, actually, I want this to be at 250, 250, or whatever. And I can use variables like width and height in here as well. So I can say, actually, I want it to be right in the center horizontally, and then at 250. And these are all things that you've seen before. I can also define my own variables. So I could say, like, let circle x equals 0, and then here maybe I'll say circle x, and then I'll maybe increase circle x over time. So this is building off of last week where we learned about animation. Whoops, circle x equals negative. Yeah, that's not going to work. Circle x equals 0. So you have this variable that tells P5 where to draw the circle. Now, this process, this approach will work if you want to define your own positioning. But what if I want to tell P5 that I actually want you to draw the circle wherever the mouse is? And so I don't know that ahead of time as the coder here. I don't know where my mouse is going to be. I certainly don't know where your mouse will be if I send this sketch to you. So I can't write code that, like, if I say 37 here, you better put your mouse at 37, otherwise it's not going to work, right? So wouldn't it be nice if P5 could tell us where the mouse is? And maybe not surprisingly, given the content of this week, you can. So instead of circle x here, I'm going to use a predefined variable that P5 gives us. It's similar to width and height in that P5 gives it to us for free. We don't have to define it ourselves. And it's called mouse x. So I'm going to type out mouse and then a capital X, mouse x. And you'll notice that in the editor, it kind of turns pink to indicate that, hey, this is a predefined P5 thing. So now if I run this, now my circle, it starts out at 0 because my mouse is actually outside of the canvas, so it just defaults to 0. But watch what happens as I move my mouse into the canvas. So now P5 is drawing the circle wherever the mouse is. And so far I've just used mouse X, but there's also a mouse Y variable as well, so I can add that in here as well. So I'm calling the circle function and passing it an X parameter of mouse X, which is a predefined variable that P5 gives you. And then I'm giving it a second parameter for the Y position of the circle. And I'm using the predefined mouse Y variable that P5 gives you, and then a size of just a hard-coded 100. So if I run that, The circle starts out at 0, 0, just because there's the defaults if it hasn't seen the mouse at all. But as I move my mouse around inside my canvas, my circle will draw wherever my mouse is. So this is a common way to get the mouse position from the user, from P5. You can ask P5, hey, where is the user's mouse? Okay, and then use those values for whatever you want. Right now I'm using them to draw a circle, like wherever the mouse is, but nothing is preventing you from doing, anything you want with these variables. So I could, switch them actually, and this will work. It'll be a little trippy because now my circle moves like not with my mouse, but kind of like, I don't know, the reverse of whatever I'm doing. So as I move my mouse to the right, my circle goes down, and as I move my circle down, it moves to the right. So it's a little flipped, and that's legal code, and it can be kind of a fun artifact to play with. But my point here is that you don't always have to use mouse X and mouse Y for X and Y coordinates of shapes. You can use them for really anything you want. But they exist, and they are there, and that's how you get from P5 where the mouse is. Okay, so now I have a circle kind of drawing wherever my mouse is, and that's all good. But let's say that I want to do something like create, I don't know, like a drawing program where instead of clearing out the background every time, I continually draw a circle. And so I can get rid of that background call, and now this will draw a circle that kind of follows around my mouse. Let me maybe move background up here just so we have a little bit of a difference in the background color. But anyway, I can move my mouse around in the canvas, and P5 will continually draw a circle wherever my mouse is. And we talked about this a little bit last week, but now that I've moved background outside of draw, I'm no longer clearing out the old frame. So you get this artifact where the old circles kind of add up to this kind of, I don't know, this snaky looking effect. Doesn't have to be circle, could be a square, could be really anything, but the idea is the same, where I am drawing a shape wherever the mouse is, and I'm not clearing out old frames. So what if I want to only draw a square when I'm actually clicking the mouse? So right now I'm always just drawing a square wherever the mouse is, and if I click, like, nothing happens. So what if I want to only draw my square when I'm clicking the mouse? And that's a different variable that P5 gives you. And again, all of this is in the reference. So what I'm going to talk about next is this mouse is pressed variable. So you can go here for more information if you want, but I'll just kind of talk through it. The mouse is pressed variable, it probably tells you in here somewhere, is a Boolean. And we learned about Booleans 2 videos ago, where you can use them with if statements. So the mouse is pressed variable is a Boolean that is either true or false. So I can use it in an if statement. So I can do something like this, where I say if mouse is pressed, then with a curly brace, then I will draw a square, and otherwise I won't do anything. So now my code is saying 60 times a second, whenever draw is called, whenever draw happens, I ask P5, hey P5, is the mouse pressed? If mouse is pressed, then draw a square wherever the mouse actually is. So now if I run my code, I can move my mouse around and nothing happens, because this if statement is not being triggered, because mouse is pressed is false right now. And as soon as I click my mouse, the squares will start to show up. So I'm going to do that now. Ready? So now I see my square, and now if I drag my mouse around, now I can sort of conditionally draw something. So now I'm going to let my mouse go, and I can continue moving my mouse around, and my square is not drawn. So I can use this to now kind of, I don't know, draw little shapes or whatever I want. I'll draw like a little smiley face or something. And all of this is done in basically 3 lines of code. And one of them is a curly brace. But I say if mouse is pressed, then draw a square. Otherwise, do nothing. So that's mouse is pressed. And you can use these concepts and mix and match them depending on what your goals are. So it's hard for me to say like ahead of time, like you should always use this, because what you should use is kind of dependent on what your goal is. But the next thing I want to talk about is what if right now I draw a square like as long as the mouse is held down. But what if I only want to draw a square like when I first press my mouse? Like I want to draw one square, and then if I keep drawing, I don't want to draw all those extra squares. I want the user to have to click for every square. And this gets at a kind of a different concept, and I've kind of glossed over a few things in the previous weeks. So now I want to maybe just take a step back and talk about the setup and draw functions. I talked about this a little bit last week with the with animations, but as a maybe refresher, the setup function is called by P5 one time at the very beginning of the sketch. When the sketch first runs, it runs whatever code is inside these curly braces. So in this case, I create my canvas and I draw a background. I only draw the background one time at the very beginning of the sketch. Then draw is automatically called 60 times a second. So you get that like animation loop that P5 gives you. You can define other functions. So setup and draw are 2 of them, and P5 will call them automatically for you, but there are others. So for example, you can define a mouse pressed function, or mouse clicked, or double clicked, all of these different functions. I want to go with maybe mouse pressed because that's kind of similar to what I was already doing. And the syntax for it is very similar to both the setup and the draw function. So let me maybe give myself some white space. And notice that I'm doing this like outside of the curly brace for draw. I'm defining a new function sort of at the top level of the sketch. So outside of any of the curly braces for setup or draw. And I'm going to type the function keyword, which is defining a new function, and then mouse pressed, in this case, mouse pressed. So I write the name of the function, and then an open and close parenthesis, and then an open and close curly brace, and I like to give myself some white space in between the curly braces. If that syntax is hard to remember, then go to the reference and steal it from there, honestly. Or you can steal it from what you already have in your sketch function draw. So anyway, back to my code. Now I have this function mouse pressed, this mouse pressed function, and P5 will call this function automatically one time whenever the user presses the mouse. And I can use this to my advantage because now I can say, for example, instead of saying if mouse is pressed 60 times a second, which is creating this kind of artifact of multiple squares, I want to kind of steal this code, and I'm going to move it from this draw function. So now my draw function is going to be empty, and I'm going to move my square into the mouse pressed function. So now my sketch, the code for my sketch is saying at setup time, which happens one time at the very beginning, create a canvas and draw a gray background. 60 times a second, do nothing. We're not going to add anything new to the sketch 60 times a second. But when the mouse is pressed, then P5 will call this code. In this case, it's just a single line of code. And I'm going to draw a square wherever the mouse is. So now let me run that. And now if I click, you'll see the square. But if I drag my mouse around, you don't see those extra squares. So if I release my mouse, I don't see a square. Yeah, I don't see a square. I wasn't sure about that one. But if I click again, then you can see the next square. And now I have to click for each individual square. And again, there's no right or wrong. I think you should go with whatever artifact, whatever effect you are going for. It's kind of, there's no wrong answer here, but these are just different ways to think about getting input from the user. Okay, so that's mouse X and mouse Y, and we talked about the mouse is pressed variable, which is a quick way in draw to just check whether the mouse is currently pressed, and then we talked about the mouse pressed function. And I think that's about as far as I'm going to go with mouse input. There are a ton of other things that you can do, but they generally will follow the same pattern. They're either going to be a variable that gives you some information, like for example, mouse button. I haven't talked about this, but this gives you like which button the mouse on the mouse is being clicked, so like left or right, or some mice have like a middle button. So if you want to distinguish between like a left click and a right click, for example, you can use the mouse button variable. But I'm not going to talk in great detail because it's the same idea. It's a variable that P5 gives you that tells you something about the state of the sketch, or more specifically, the state of the user's mouse. So check out the reference if you want more information about that. Similarly, like I demoed the mouse pressed function here, but there are other event functions. So instead of mouse pressed, I could have said like, actually, I want the user to have to double click to add a square. And the idea is very similar, so I won't go over it in great detail, but just please know that in the reference, there's a ton of other ways that you can get like different kinds of information about the mouse. Okay, so that was mouse input. Next, I want to talk about keyboard input. That's another really common thing to want to do. So let me maybe start over with a new sketch. Let me open up a new editor, and what do I want to talk about first? So first, let's say I want to do something whenever the user is pressing a key. I don't care what key it is. If they're pressing a key, I want to do something. Otherwise, I want to do something else. So by now you can probably guess at some of this, but P5 gives you a variable, and it's very similar to the mouse is pressed variable that we saw a second ago. Instead, it's key is pressed. And so it's a variable. It gives me a Boolean, true or false, that I can use with if statements, and I can now do something if the key is pressed and something else if it's not. So for example, let me say if key is pressed, then with my curly braces that we all know and love, let's say I want to draw like a green background, so RGB, and oops, otherwise I want to, maybe I'll just use my gray background. So my code, if I read through it line by line, is saying in the draw function, which happens 60 times a second, I say if key is pressed, so if a key is being pressed right now, then I draw a green background. Otherwise, I'll draw a gray background. So let me run this. And right now, it's just gray because I'm not pressing any keys, I promise. So it's this Boolean variable is false, which means that this if statement evaluates to false and it's not triggered. So it skips this line of code, goes down to my else, and does run this code. So it draws the gray background. Now, as soon as I press a key, so first of all, I click inside the canvas first, just because if I press a key over here, like I'll be typing. I clicked over here into my canvas just so it has the keyword focus, and now I'm going to type a key. I'm going to press down a key. And now you see, like, as long as I hold down my keyboard, I'm drawing a green background. And now if I let go of that key, it goes back to being gray because the other side of that if statement is true, or the other condition here. If key pressed turns back to being false, so it goes down to this else statement and goes back to being the gray background. Okay, so that's getting whether a key is pressed at all, and that can be useful. Again, there's no right or wrong. It kind of depends on what you want to do. But what if you want to do different things depending on which key is pressed? And spoiler alert, there are ways to do that. So there's another variable in P5 called key, which contains a text value, which contains what key is being typed. I'm trying to look for an example. I guess this just prints it out, and that's fine. But yeah, maybe I'll just play with this here. So right now, this this code right here is, oops, that's funny, is in the draw function. It's drawing a background and it's drawing the key to the screen using the text keyboard. So let me click in here and type like F. So there's an F. I can type, you know, A, B, C, D, E. It holds the value, which is a letter of whatever key I just typed. So let me go back to my code and kind of use that. So the reference here, it just prints it to the screen, and that's cool. That is maybe what you want to do. But what I want to do is compare the value of the key variable to other letters, and I want to do something specific depending on the value of that variable. So for example, maybe here I want to say, instead of if key is pressed, maybe I'll say if key, and I'm going to have double equals because I'm comparing it to a value, and then in quotation mark, a single quotation mark, actually either one will work, but I use a single quotation mark, equals, in this case, what did I say? So G here. So now if I type G, then I will draw a green background. Otherwise, I'll draw a gray background. So it starts out gray, and that's because this if statement is evaluating to false, so it's skipping that. So as soon as I type G, now I've switched it basically to drawing green. And I can add a few if statements in here. Maybe I'll say like if key equals R, then I want to draw maybe red background of RGB, and I'll change this to an else if just for the sake of writing reasonable code. So now I have if the key is whoops, and actually here's a good maybe stopping point, because I just realized I made a mistake, but let me maybe run through this and see what happens. So let me run this, and okay, cool. Yeah, I kind of knew that this would happen. So I got an error, and I've said many times now that getting errors is a normal part of coding. So that means I need to kind of pause and stop and say, okay, it's complaining about this line. There's something wrong on this line. And it's saying reference error, R is not defined. What the heck? So that means I look at this line and I say, okay, R is not defined. I wonder why that is. And what I need to do is sort of compare the code I have with what I intended and with what's in like the content that I've already given y'all. So for example, here I kind of know that in this particular case, the problem is that I forgot the little quotation marks around R. The reason you need them is because if you don't have the quotation marks, P5 assumes that you are talking about a variable. And so if I don't have them, P5 is saying, oh, you want to check whether the key variable equals the R variable. And there isn't an R variable, which is what the error message is complaining about. So to indicate to P5 that I don't mean a variable, I actually mean like some text, I need to put in that quotation mark. Okay, so now I think my code is fixed. And what it's saying is if the key that I typed is R, then draw a red background. Otherwise, if the key that I typed is green, then draw a green background. Otherwise, draw a gray background. So I can run this and it'll start out gray because I haven't typed anything yet. If I type my R, now it's red. And if I type my G, now it's green. If I type a different letter, I'm going to type, I don't know, K, then it goes back to being gray because if key equals R, it's not, it's K, so we skip that. Otherwise, is key G? No, it's still K. Therefore, I'm going to fall down to this and I'll just draw my gray background. Okay, so there's one sort of artifact in my sketch right now, and that is the key variable holds whatever letter you most recently typed. It doesn't tell you whether you are currently typing it or not. So for example, if I just tap R, if I type R and I let go of it, it stays red. And that's because key holds the last letter I typed, and the last letter I typed was R. If instead of always being red, I wanted it to like only show red if I'm holding down R, or only show green if I'm holding down green, then I can mix and match. So I can bring back that, I think key is pressed, right? Variable that I was just using, and check both cases. Yeah, key is pressed. So if I go here, a couple ways I can do this. Maybe I will say if key is pressed and key equals R. Otherwise, key is pressed and key equals G. I think this will work. So let me run this. And now I'm going to type R and then I'm going to let it go. So R and then let it go. And yeah, so this works because I am checking both conditions. I need the key is pressed variable to be true, which only happens, it's only true when I'm currently holding down a key. And I need the most recently pressed key to be R. And so if those are both true, then it means that I'm currently pressing R. There's another way to sort of organize this code. And again, this all comes down to kind of personal preference. But let me kind of show you both ways. I can say if key is pressed, then I can move some of this down here. And I can say this, where I'm only checking which key is pressed if a key is pressed. Does that make sense? Maybe let me explain that in a second. So now what I'm saying is if the key is pressed, then I only check the letters if the key is pressed. So you can have if statements inside of if statements, no problem. So I say if key is pressed, then if the key is R, then I draw a red background. Otherwise, if the key is G, then I draw a green background. And maybe I can throw in another like else here just for fun. I can say else, maybe I'll draw like a blue background. Else 00255 RGB. And then if my key is not pressed, then I'm just going to draw a gray background. So let me run this and just kind of talk through what happens. So by default, I'm just drawing gray because this else is what's being triggered. And as soon as I press a key, so I'm going to press R at first. I'm going to hold it in, and now key is pressed is true, and key equals R is also true, so it's red. If I let go, now I go back to gray, and if I type G, cool. If I type like K, now it's blue because this line is being triggered. So anyway, I think I kind of over-explained that, I think, but the idea is that you can mix and match these variables to achieve like more complicated effects. Yeah, let me think about this. So there's a couple other things I could talk about. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to just mention where you can get more information about them instead of talking through them in great detail. So I will say key holds the most recently typed letter, but what happens if what you typed is not a letter? So what if I type, I don't know, like the left arrow or the control key or like a shift, or one of those that aren't actually a letter, they are like a code, a representation of something else. So if I want to check for that kind of thing, I can use the key code variable instead of key. Works very similarly, except instead of comparing it to a text value like R or G or B or whatever, I compare it to a predefined variable such as up arrow, down arrow, etc. So here's a list of the kinds of variables you can compare it to, but the idea is the same. You use the key code variable to write an if statement that compares it to one of those other values. So real quick, I can say if key code equals, I don't know, let's say left arrow, And notice here, I don't put a single quotation mark around left arrow because this is a variable now. So now if I run this, now I have to type the left arrow to make my background turn red. So you can't see my keyboard, but I'm holding in the left arrow right now. And so this is another way to compare what's happening on the user's keyboard to what you are looking for. Okay, so that's key code. The next thing I want to talk about is, okay, similar to my mouse example, right now I am doing things whenever the user is holding down a key. So let me maybe change this back to R. So I'm doing something whenever the user presses a key. As long as I hold it down, it'll continue to happen. What if I only want it to happen one time, right when I type the letter, but I don't want it to continue happening? And similar to the mouse pressed function or any of those other functions that I kind of mentioned before, P5 also gives you these other key related functions. So for example, key typed or key released or key pressed. So let's play with the key released function, I guess. Yeah, I'm going to kind of get rid of some of this code. So instead of drawing anything in draw, actually maybe I'll go back and draw like a circle wherever the mouse is, just for fun. Mouse X, mouse Y, 25 or so. So now my draw function is drawing a circle wherever the mouse is, background 220. And that's cool, but now I want to maybe clear out my circles whenever I type a key. And I don't want to like continually clear it out whenever I like hold in the key. I only want to do it when the key is released, actually. So similar to the mouse pressed function, I can define a new function using the function keyword. And in this case, it is key released here. So I type in key released with capital R, and then an opening and closing parentheses, and then an opening and closing curly brace with some white space in there. So here, maybe I'll just draw like a background of 220. Whoops, 220. So let me run this, and so I can move my mouse around, and that's cool, and it works, and that's great. And now I can press a key, and I'm holding in the F key right now, and nothing's happening. And now I'm going to release my F key. And now my old circles are cleared out. I draw my gray background, and I only have a single circle because I'm back in the draw function, drawing circles wherever the mouse is. And you know, you can get more playful with this. I can always like draw like a random background, maybe. Whoops. Random 255, random 255, random 255. So now whenever I press or whenever I release a key, it'll actually draw a randomly colored background. So I'll just have to click in there first. So now I've drawn just a random colored background when I released the key, but my circles can come back. And I'll do another one, type another key, and now it's slightly different. And so it's this way to do something whenever a certain event happens, in this case, key released. Okay, I think that's about as far as I want to go. I will say that the purpose of this video was not to talk about every single thing you can possibly do to get input from the user. It was to talk about the concepts that you'll use when you are getting input from the user. So at a high level, generally, you're either going to be using a variable like the mouse X or mouse Y or key code variable, or you're going to be using a function such as the mouse pressed function or the key pressed function, key released, double clicked function. All of these are sort of functions that you can add to your code that P5 will automatically call. And from there, it's up to you. It's up to you to decide what events you care about or what variables you care about. And you can mix and match, but what you do kind of depends on your end goal. So yeah, feel free to like look through this reference and explore it and play with it that way. Okay, so that was various ways to get user input, and more importantly, how to learn how to get user input. So please let me know as you have questions. If you're looking through the reference and you want to chat more about anything, or if you're curious about how to do something, let me know. But for now, I'll say thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.